Get out! Thief! And take those brats with you. Don't ever come back. Mr. Richardson ordered you gone for stealing." A torn plastic bag flew from the window. The door slammed shut like a tomb. Margaret Williams collapsed onto the frozen snow, her knees sinking into the ice as she clutched her 6-month-old twins. Sophie and Emma's heartbreaking cries mixed with wind that cut like knives. The cruel housekeeper had lied. She had invented a theft that never existed. And now an innocent mother was walking toward death with her babies in her arms. But from the second-floor study, someone had seen everything, without moving, without speaking, but with a burning heart. If this story already touched your heart in these first seconds, subscribe to the channel. Here you'll find stories that heal, inspire, and make you believe in human goodness again. 6 hours before that cursed night, Richardson Estate awakened in silence. The first rays of sun filtered through the leaded glass, creating long shadows on the cold marble. Margaret Williams had already spent 2 hours cleaning every corner with that delicacy that only comes from hands that know the value of work. At 31 years old, Margaret had learned to be invisible. Her steps made no sound on the polished parquet. Her movements were precise, calculated, as if she had been born to care for other people's houses while her own didn't exist. Her twins, Sophie and Emma, slept in an improvised crib in the servants' quarters. 6 months of life, and they had already known more cold than love. Margaret looked at them between tasks, whispering songs that her own mother never sang to her. "You're the only lights in this house," she murmured, while folding the Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than her 3-month salary. The mansion was a mausoleum of luxuries and loneliness. Thomas Richardson, a 39-year-old widower, was an elegant ghost who wandered the hallways aimlessly. His wife had died 2 years earlier, and since then he had locked himself in a sadness so thick it seemed to infect the walls. Margaret saw him pass some mornings, always in a dark suit, always with that lost look searching for something that no longer existed. He never spoke to her directly, but she had noticed how he stopped when he heard the babies crying. Once, just once, she had caught him smiling while watching the twins from the servants' quarters doorway. But when he realized Margaret was looking at him, he walked away as if he had committed a crime. "Mr. Richardson doesn't allow noise," Gertrude had warned her, the housekeeper, a 60-year-old woman with a heart turned to stone. "The girls must stay quiet, or you'll have problems." Gertrude Mason had been running that house with an iron fist for 15 years. She was thin as a knife and twice as sharp. Her gray eyes seemed to constantly search for errors, as if her happiness depended on finding flaws in others. There was something about the way she looked at the twins that chilled Margaret's blood. It wasn't just contempt. It was something darker, more dangerous. "Why do you have them here?" she asked one afternoon while Margaret was changing diapers. "A decent woman doesn't have children without a husband." "I am decent," Margaret replied without raising her voice, but her hands trembled slightly. "And my daughters didn't choose to be born. They deserve love like any child." Gertrude smiled with that smile that never reached her eyes. "Love doesn't pay the bills, dear. And in this house, bills are always collected." That afternoon, while preparing dinner, Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Something was moving in the mansion's shadows. Something that smelled like danger and tasted like goodbye. From the dining room came the lonely sound of Mr. Richardson's silverware. He ate alone, always alone, surrounded by 20 empty chairs that seemed to accuse him of something Margaret didn't understand. Her twins babbled in their crib, oblivious to the adult world and its cruelties. Margaret kissed their foreheads, and felt that kiss tasted like promise and farewell at the same time. She didn't know that night would be the last they'd spend under that roof. She didn't know that Gertrude had already planted the seeds of a lie that would grow like weeds, but somewhere in the mansion, behind the closed door of a study, someone else couldn't sleep either. Someone who had started noticing things, hearing cries, wondering how it was possible that such a big house felt so empty when there were 3 new hearts beating in it. The approaching storm wasn't just snow. The pearl necklace lay on the mahogany dresser like a mother-of-pearl serpent. Gertrude contemplated it with those gray eyes that calculated every movement, every word, every lie she was about to weave. It had belonged to Helen Richardson, the master's deceased wife. 3 strands of Tahitian pearls worth more than any employee's entire life. Gertrude had taken it from the jewelry box that morning, while the master was in his study, lost in those papers that never seemed to console him. "Perfect," she murmured, sliding the necklace inside the small cloth bag Margaret kept under her bed. The plan was simple and cruel like herself. She just needed the perfect moment. That moment came at 10 o'clock at night. Margaret had just put the twins to bed after feeding them their bottles. Their little breaths created a symphony of peace in the servants' quarters, the only place in the mansion where love seemed real. "Margaret Williams!" Gertrude's scream pierced the hallways like a knife. Margaret ran toward the main hall, her heart pounding her ribs. The twins woke up and began to cry. "What's wrong, Mrs. Mason? What's wrong?" The housekeeper held the necklace between her bony fingers, as if it were evidence. "This happened. I found Mrs. Helen's necklace in your bag." Margaret's world swayed, her legs turned to water. That's impossible. I would never touch something that isn't mine." "Liar!" Gertrude approached, her sour breath hitting Margaret's face. "I knew I couldn't trust a nobody like you. A woman without a husband who brings bastards into decent people's homes." Tears ran down Margaret's cheeks like rivers of desperation. "Please, Mrs. Mason, I haven't stolen anything. There must be a mistake. Please." "The only mistake was letting you into this house. Pack your trash and get out. The master has already been informed and ordered your immediate dismissal." Can I speak with him? Explain that." "No! The master doesn't waste time with thieves. You have 5 minutes to leave before I call the police." Margaret ran to the servants' quarters. Her hands shook so much she could barely stuff her few clothes into the torn bag. The twins cried as if they sensed the world was crumbling. "Calm down, my loves," she whispered while wrapping them in the thickest blankets she had. "Mommy will take care of you, always." But even as she spoke those words, the cold of desperation bit her soul. She had no money. She had no family. She had nowhere to go in the middle of winter's worst storm. Gertrude followed her to the front door, enjoying every second of her power. "And don't think about coming back. If I see you near this house, I'll have you arrested for attempted theft and child endangerment." The icy wind hit Margaret like a fist when the door opened. Snow fell so thick you could barely see the garden. "Please," she begged one last time. "It's very cold. My babies." You should have thought of that before stealing. Margaret took one step toward the deadly night, then another. Her bare feet sank into the snow like into a white grave. But what neither woman knew was that in the second-floor study, Thomas Richardson had heard every scream, every plea, every lie. He stood by the window, motionless as a statue, while watching the woman who had cared for his house for months walk toward death with her babies in her arms. His hand rested on the telephone. One call could stop everything. One word from him could save them. But he didn't move. He didn't speak. At least, not yet. What secrets did that silent man's heart hold? And why did he allow that injustice to happen under his own roof? Thomas Richardson couldn't close his eyes all night. Every time he tried to sleep, he heard the echo of Margaret's pleas, the desperate crying of the twins, the sound of the door closing like a death sentence. He got up at 5 in the morning and wandered the mansion like a lost soul. His steps echoed in the empty hallways, every sound amplified by the guilt that ate at his chest. He reached the servants' quarters where Margaret and her daughters had lived. The room was too quiet, too cold. On the floor, he found a small pink baby hat, forgotten in the rush of escape. He picked it up with trembling hands. It was soft as a caress, small as a sigh. It smelled of innocence and that unique perfume that newborn babies have. "My God," he murmured, and for the first time in 2 years, those words didn't sound empty. He went downstairs like a sleepwalker. In the kitchen, Gertrude was preparing breakfast while humming an off-key melody, as if she hadn't destroyed 3 lives the night before. "Good morning, Mr. Richardson. Shall I prepare your coffee as usual?" Thomas observed her with new eyes. How had he not seen before that coldness, that cruel satisfaction that shone in her gaze? "Gertrude?" His voice sounded hoarse, strange. "Are you sure Margaret stole the necklace?" The housekeeper didn't blink. "Of course, sir. I found it in her bag. Do you doubt me after 15 years of loyal service?" "Where is the necklace now?" "In the safe, where it always should have been. Don't worry about that woman anymore, sir. She was a bad influence in this house." But Thomas was no longer listening. Something in Gertrude's too confident tone, in that smile that didn't fit the gravity of the situation, made his skin crawl. He went out to the garden. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold was still brutal. He followed the tracks Margaret had left the night before. Small, deep footprints that moved away from the mansion like a silent cry for help. He followed them for 20 minutes until reaching the Pine Lodge boarding house, a decrepit building in the poorest part of town. The tracks ended at the main door. Thomas hid behind an abandoned car and waited. An hour later, Margaret came out with the twins. Her face was gaunt, her lips blue from cold. The babies barely moved, wrapped in blankets that no longer protected them. He followed her at a distance while she walked the streets looking for work. Door after door, rejection after rejection. Nobody wanted to hire a woman with 2 babies, especially one who had been fired for theft. "Please," he heard her beg at a clothing store. "I just need a chance. I can work nights when my daughters sleep." "I'm sorry." Always the same phrase. "We don't have anything available." Thomas felt something break inside his chest. That woman had cared for his house, had unknowingly cleaned his emotional wounds, had brought life to a mansion that smelled like death. And he had allowed them to destroy her. He returned home with a heart heavy as stone. In the study, he opened the safe. There was Helen's necklace, shining like an accusation. But there was something strange. The pearls were clean, too clean. They didn't have a speck of dust, as if someone had cleaned them recently. However, they had been in the safe for 2 years, untouched. Thomas closed his eyes, and for the first time since his wife's death, he thought clearly. Helen had been kind, generous, incapable of judging others. If she were alive, she never would have allowed them to throw a mother with babies onto the street, especially in winter. "What happened to you, Thomas?" He could hear her soft voice like a breeze. "When did you become such a coward?" That night, while Gertrude slept, Thomas reviewed the house's security cameras. What he saw froze his blood and ignited his anger at the same time. There was Gertrude, clear as day, taking the necklace from Helen's jewelry box and putting it in Margaret's bag while she bathed the twins. The lie had been perfect, the cruelty absolute. But most painful was seeing himself in that night's recording. Standing at the window, motionless, allowing injustice to happen, allowing 3 innocents to be sentenced by his cowardice. Thomas turned off the cameras and remained in his study's darkness. Outside, the city slept unaware of the pain that had been committed under his roof. But he could no longer sleep. He could no longer pretend he didn't know the truth. The question now was, would he be brave enough to make it right? Dawn came with the fury of a man who had found his purpose. Thomas dressed with the determination of someone who had decided to stop being a coward. Gertrude was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when he came down. Her usual smile faded, seeing the expression on her employer's face. "Mr. Richardson, you're fired." The words fell like stones in a silent pond. Gertrude blinked several times, as if she hadn't understood. "Excuse me?" "I know what you did, Gertrude. I saw the cameras. I saw how you put the necklace in Margaret's bag. Color fled from the housekeeper's face like water down a drain. Mr. Richardson, I don't know what you're talking about." Enough! Thomas's voice resonated through the entire kitchen. 15 years, Gertrude. 15 years trusting you while you destroyed innocent people's lives. How many more? How many employees did you fire with lies? Gertrude straightened up, recovering some of her usual arrogance. That woman had no right to be here. A nobody with bastards doesn't... Silence! Thomas approached, tall and threatening. Those bastards, as you call them, are two innocent babies who could have died because of your cruelty. And that nobody was a hard-working woman who cared for my house better than you in all these years. Are you willing to ruin your reputation for a domestic employee? My reputation is already ruined. For cowardice, for allowing this to happen under my roof. You have 1 hour to leave. And Gertrude, if you ever come near Margaret or her daughters again, you'll learn what a rich man is capable of when he really wants to destroy someone. 30 minutes later, Gertrude Mason left Richardson Estate with an old suitcase and a heart full of poison. But it no longer mattered. The damage was done. Thomas drove to the Pine Lodge boarding house with a bag full of money and a heart full of hope. He had rehearsed the words during the entire trip. He would ask for forgiveness. He would offer her job back. He would give her a house, education for the girls, everything they needed. He found Margaret in the small room she shared with her daughters. The twins slept in a cardboard box lined with towels. The room smelled of humidity and desperation. "Mr. Richardson!" Margaret jumped up, surprised. "What? What are you doing here?" "I came to ask your forgiveness, Margaret, and to offer you your job back." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of relief. They were something more complex, more painful. "Did you know?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Did you know I hadn't stolen anything?" Thomas looked down, ashamed. "I found out later. I saw the cameras. Gertrude put the necklace in your bag while you were bathing the girls." "Later?" Margaret approached, and for the first time in months, there was fire in her eyes. "You allowed me to go out into the snow with my babies knowing I was innocent." "Margaret, Do you know what happened last night, Mr. Richardson? Sophie had a fever. Emma wouldn't stop coughing. I thought they were going to die. I thought my daughters were going to die for something I didn't do, and you knew and did nothing." The words were stabs to Thomas, each one more accurate than the last. "You're right. I'm a coward. But now I want to fix it. Come back home. I'll give you whatever you ask." Margaret looked at him with a mixture of sadness and disappointment that was worse than any scream. "I can't, Mr. Richardson." "Why?" "I'll pay you double, triple. Because I don't want to raise my daughters in a house where contempt disguises itself as charity. Because I don't want them to grow up thinking they should be grateful for scraps from those who see them as inferior." Margaret walked toward the room's dirty window. "My daughters will grow up knowing they're worth as much as any child from any mansion. They'll grow up with dignity, even if it's in poverty. Margaret, please. Thank you for coming, Mr. Richardson." But the answer is no. Thomas left that boarding house with his heart more broken than when he'd arrived. It wasn't just the rejection. It was understanding that he had lost something more valuable than money, the respect of an extraordinary woman. That night, alone in his empty mansion, Thomas Richardson made the decision that would change the rest of his life. If Margaret didn't want his charity, he would give her something different. He would give her the opportunity to prove to her and the world what he was really made of. But first he had to prove what he was made of. Would a rich man be capable of winning the heart of a woman who no longer believed in human goodness? The following days were a revelation for Thomas Richardson. For the first time in years, he had a purpose that went beyond his own grief. He sold 3 of his luxury cars and donated the money to shelters for single mothers. He transformed 2 mansion rooms into a free childcare center. He hired employee mothers with decent salaries and flexible hours. But above all, every afternoon at 6, he appeared at the Pine Lodge boarding house door with a pot of hot soup. "It's not charity," he told Margaret when she protested. "It's a debt. A debt I have with you and all mothers who struggle alone. At first, Margaret accepted the food only for her daughters, but something in Thomas's constancy, in that new humility that replaced his previous coldness, began to soften her heart's defenses. Sophie and Emma, now 8 months old, had started recognizing him. When they saw him arrive, they stretched their chubby arms toward him, smiling with those smiles only babies have when they trust completely. "Hello, princesses," he whispered while carrying them. "How are my favorite girls?" One March afternoon, when the snow had begun to melt and the first flowers peeked out in the parks, Margaret found him sitting on the floor of the room, playing with the twins. Sophie had fallen asleep in his arms, while Emma played with his shirt buttons. "Why do you do this?" Margaret asked, sitting beside him. "Why do you come every day?" Thomas looked at the babies, then at her. "Because when Helen died, I thought love had died with me, that I could never again feel this." He touched Sophie's face with infinite tenderness. "You three gave me back something I thought was lost forever." "What?" "The ability to protect instead of just possess. To give without expecting. To be a father." Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. "Mr. Richardson." "Thomas. Please, just Thomas." Thomas. His name sounded different on Margaret's lips, softer, more intimate. I don't know if I can love again. After everything I went through." "You don't have to love," he replied, cradling Sophie. "Just let me be here. Let me be part of this. Let me learn to be a better person alongside you." Emma began to babble, as if she were giving her approval to the plan. Margaret laughed despite her tears. "I think Emma agrees." "And Sophie?" They looked at the baby sleeping in Thomas's arms. She breathed peacefully, with that absolute trust only children have when they feel safe. "Sophie already decided," Margaret whispered. "From the first time you held her." Thomas looked into her eyes. "And their mom? What did their mom decide?" Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of all the days of struggle, all the rejections, all the cold nights, but also feeling the warmth of those afternoons, the constancy of that man who had learned to love without conditions. Their mom decided that maybe it's time to believe in human goodness again. When she opened her eyes, Thomas was smiling. Not the sad smile he had worn for 2 years, but a new smile, full of hope and promises. "Then let's start by healing," he said. "All 4 of us together." 6 months later, Margaret and the twins moved to Richardson Estate, but no longer as employees, as family. Thomas had completely renovated the house. The cold marbles were replaced with warm woods. The silent hallways now resonated with baby laughter and lullabies. And in the garden, where desperate footprints had once remained in the snow, red roses now bloomed that Thomas and Margaret planted together the day they decided that love can be reborn after winter. But would this story of redemption and second chances really have a happy ending? 12 years had transformed not only Richardson Estate, but the heart of an entire region. The Helen Richardson Center, named in honor of Thomas's first wife, had become a 5-building complex that housed the most important shelter for single mothers in 3 states. Its therapeutic gardens, training workshops, daycare centers, and medical clinics served over 1,000 families each year. Sophie and Emma, now 12 years old, had grown up seeing their home transform into a beacon of hope. Their laughter mixed with that of hundreds of children running through hallways that were once cold and silent. Every morning they had breakfast alongside mothers of all ages, listening to stories of overcoming that had made them wise girls beyond their years. Margaret, now 43 years old, not only directed the center, but had written 3 books that had become international bestsellers. Invisible No More had been translated into 18 languages. Her restorative dignity methodology was studied at universities on 4 continents, but what made her proudest were the thousands of letters that arrived each week from women who had found strength in her story. Thomas had discovered that his fortune, when shared with purpose, multiplied in ways impossible to explain. His international foundation had replicated the Helen Richardson Center model in 22 countries. Hospitals bearing his name provided free care to vulnerable mothers and children. Scholarships had allowed over 5,000 young people to access higher education. But his greatest achievement remained coming home each afternoon and listening to his daughters tell about their day's adventures. This morning was historic. Sophie had been selected, among thousands of students nationwide, to present her essay to the National Congress as part of the Voices of the Future program. Her topic, a proposal so no child in this country grows up feeling invisible. She had worked on it for 6 months, interviewing sociologists, economists, and above all, the center's mothers. The National Congress was fuller than ever before. Senators, representatives, ministers, ambassadors, and delegates from international organizations had come to listen to the 12-year-old girl who had moved the country with her story. Television cameras broadcast live to the entire nation. In the front row, Margaret trembled with emotion while adjusting the gold medallion Sophie wore around her neck, a gift from her adoptive grandmother Carmen, the first woman who had found refuge in their home after them. "Are you ready to change the world, my warrior?" Margaret whispered. "I've been ready since that night in the snow, Mom. I just have the words now." Emma, who had insisted on accompanying her twin sister, squeezed her hand with that telepathic connection only sisters have. "The whole country is listening to you, Sophie. But speak only to that girl who's somewhere feeling lost. She's the one who needs you most." Thomas, who had been silent all morning, approached and put his hands on Sophie's shoulders. "Princess, 12 years ago I held you when you weighed 11 pounds and fit in my arms. Today, you're going to carry the weight of changing an entire country. But remember, you're not alone. We carry with you the love of thousands of families who have healed thanks to you." Sophie walked toward the Congress's main podium. Her shoes resonated on the marble with the confidence of someone carrying a divine mission. The silence was so deep, you could hear the collective heartbeat of the entire nation waiting. "Honorable Congresspeople, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen," Sophie began with a voice that filled every corner of the chamber. "My name is Sophie Richardson Williams. I'm 12 years old, and I come to speak to you on behalf of all the invisible children in this country. My essay is called The Value of the Invisible," Sophie announced with a voice that filled the entire auditorium. 12 years ago, my sister Emma and I were expelled into the coldest winter night. We were 6 months old. Our mother had been falsely accused of theft. We had nowhere to go, no money, no hope. We only had the unbreakable love of a woman who decided her daughters were worth more than circumstances. That night, we should have died. Statistics say babies like us don't survive sub-zero temperatures. But something extraordinary happened. A man who had lost faith in humanity saw us from his window and decided it was time to recover it. Today, 12 years later, I don't come here as a victim of that night. I come as an architect of a future where no child has to go through what we went through. Congresspeople, in this country there are 1,700,000 children in vulnerable situations, 1,700,000 futures being wasted for lack of opportunities. But I don't just come to talk about numbers. I come to talk about names. Carmen arrived at our center with 3 malnourished children and a black eye. Today she owns the most successful hair salon chain in the region and employs 25 single mothers. Lucia arrived unable to read or write. Today she's a public accountant and financial advisor to 12 small women-owned businesses. Maria Elena arrived with self-esteem destroyed by years of violence. Today she runs the state's largest community kitchen and feeds 2,000 families each month. These aren't miracles, Congresspeople. This is what happens when a country decides to invest in dignity instead of pity, in opportunities instead of handouts, in families instead of statistics. That's why I come today with a concrete proposal. The National Second Chances Plan. A comprehensive system that guarantees no mother has to choose between working and caring for her children, and no child grows up feeling less valuable because of their birth circumstances. My proposal has 5 fundamental pillars. First, comprehensive development centers in every municipality in the country, where mothers can train professionally while their children receive quality education and nutritious food. Second, national microcredit system with mandatory mentorship, so women receive not just money but knowledge to create sustainable businesses. Third, national godparent family network, where families who have overcome their crises emotionally adopt those starting their recovery process. Fourth, business policies that incentivize hiring single mothers with flexible schedules, corporate daycare, and special benefits for those who demonstrate social commitment. Fifth, mandatory emotional education from preschool to form a generation that understands family diversity is a national strength, not a social weakness. Congress people, this isn't a utopian proposal. It's a plan we've been testing for 12 years in our center. A plan that has transformed 3,000 families' lives. A plan that has turned victims into leaders, dependents into entrepreneurs, invisible into national examples. But above all, it's a plan that recognizes something fundamental, that a nation's value isn't measured by its most prosperous citizens' wealth, but by its most vulnerable citizens' dignity. Because I've learned something I want to share with you. Invisible children don't exist. Only adults who have decided not to see them exist. And when a society decides to open its eyes, when it decides to open its heart, it discovers that each child carries within the potential to change the world. My mom taught me that dignity isn't begged, it's defended. My dad taught me that true love isn't perfect from the start, but perfects itself with each act of justice. My country taught me that democracy is only real when it includes all its children. Congress people, you have in your hands the power to write this nation's most beautiful story. The story of how an entire country decided no child would ever be invisible. And if there's a child listening to me now, a child who feels lost, forgotten, who thinks their story is already written, I want them to know this. Your most extraordinary chapter hasn't begun yet. The love you carry in your heart is enough to move mountains. And there's an entire nation waiting for you, arms ready to embrace you, eyes willing to see you not for where you've been, but for the incredible place you're heading. Because all, absolutely all children in this country deserve a chance to write our story with hope's ink and dignity's pages. Congress people, the future is watching us. What are we going to answer? The silence that followed was deafening. 500 Congress people had been left speechless. Then, from the most conservative bench, a senator with tears in his eyes stood up and began to applaud. One by one, the entire Congress stood up. The applause lasted 15 minutes. But Sophie only had eyes for her parents. Margaret cried with that mixture of pain and pride only mothers know who have seen their children become light for the world. Thomas trembled with emotion, knowing the girl he had held in his arms that terrible night had just changed a country's history. 3 months later, the National Congress unanimously approved the National Second Chances Plan, popularly known as Sophie's Law. But for Sophie, the greatest achievement came a week after her speech, when an 8-year-old girl approached after a conference and told her, "I also live in our car with my mom. But after listening to you, I know we're going to be okay, because someone will see us." That night, Sophie wrote in her diary, "Today I understood what we were born for in that snowy night. It wasn't to suffer. It was to learn that when a story of pain transforms into purpose, it can illuminate the path for millions of people still walking in darkness." The silence that followed was so deep you could hear the collective heartbeat of all hearts in the auditorium. Then, like a wave breaking against the shore, applause began. Teachers cried openly. Municipal authorities stood up. The center's mothers shouted, "That's our girl!" Journalists wrote frantically, knowing they had witnessed something historic. But Sophie only had eyes for her parents. Margaret cried like that night in the snow, but now they were tears of absolute triumph. Thomas had his hands together as if thanking the universe for giving him the opportunity to witness this moment. Emma ran to the stage and hugged her sister. "You just changed the world, Sophie. I'm sorry. The world will never be the same after today." And she was right, because in the months that followed, Sophie's speech went viral. Universities invited her to speak. Her story became hope for thousands of families throughout the country. That night, while the whole family celebrated at home, Sophie opened a letter she had been saving for this moment. It was from a girl in Somalia who had learned to read in one of the centers inspired by her model. "Dear Sophie," the letter said, "my name is Amina. I'm 8 years old, and before coming to the center, I thought I was invisible. Today I learned to write my name, and I want you to know that when I grow up, I'm going to help other children write theirs. Thank you for teaching me we all have the right to exist." Sophie carefully folded the letter and kept it with the thousands she had received over the years. "Do you know what's most incredible?" she asked her family. "What?" The other three responded in unison. "That it all started with an injustice that became humanity's greatest blessing. If Gertrude hadn't thrown us out that night, we never would have learned that the most beautiful stories are born from the most terrible nights," Emma completed. Thomas got up and walked to the hotel window. In the distance, he saw Stockholm's lights shining like earthly stars. "Do you know my favorite memory from all these years?" he asked. "What, Dad?" the sisters asked. "The day Emma told me, 'Thank you for not saving us that night,' because I understood that sometimes the best decisions are the ones that hurt in the moment but heal forever." Margaret approached her husband and rested her head on his shoulder. "And I learned that love isn't what rescues you from the storm. It's what teaches you to dance in the rain until the sun comes out for everyone." Sophie looked out the window toward a future that was no longer uncertain, but radiant. "And I learned that we weren't born to be saved. We were born to save. Not to be happy, but to multiply happiness. Not to receive love, but to prove that love can overcome any circumstance when it decides to become action." At that moment, Sophie's phone rang. It was a call from a small African village where Center number 1000 had just opened. "Sophie," the coordinator's excited voice said, "a mother with newborn twins just arrived. She had nowhere to go, but she knew we would receive her here. She says she heard your story and knew she wasn't alone." Sophie smiled with that smile that had illuminated the world. "Tell her to prepare the center's most beautiful room. And tell her this: welcome home. Your most beautiful story is just beginning." She hung up and looked at her family. "Ready to change the world again tomorrow?" "Always," the three responded in unison. And somewhere in the world, at that same moment, a mother hugged her children knowing there existed a place where being invisible was impossible, where second chances weren't the exception but the rule, and where every story of pain had the power to become healing for thousands. Because the best stories never end. They multiply until they fill the entire world with light. And the light that had begun on a night of snow and desperation now shone in every corner of the planet, reminding all humanity that when love decides to become action, there's no force in the universe that can stop it. The next day, while Sophie returned to her work at the Global Foundation, she received a call that made her stop in the middle of the street. "Sophie," a trembling voice told her from the other side of the world, "this is Priya, from the Mumbai Center." A 5-year-old girl who was living on the streets just arrived. When we asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she told us, "I want to be like Sophie, so no child feels invisible like I felt. I thought you'd want to know." Sophie closed her eyes, and for a moment, she was that 6-month-old baby in her mother's arms, walking toward uncertainty. But now she knew something that baby didn't know, that the darkest nights are just the prologue to the most beautiful dawns. "Tell that girl," Sophie responded with a firm voice, "that she's no longer invisible, that she has a family of 5 million people waiting for her, and that her story is going to light the path for other children still walking in darkness." Because some stories don't end with, "they lived happily ever after." They end with, "and so began a new era for humanity." And that era had begun with a lie in the snow and had become the world's most beautiful truth. That everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves love, dignity, and as many second chances as we need to find our way home. This story began with an injustice in the snow and became hope for millions. If it touched your heart, if it made you believe that love can transform any circumstance, subscribe to the channel and share it. Because somewhere in the world, there's a mother who needs to hear that her worth doesn't depend on her circumstances. There's a child who needs to know that their origin doesn't determine their destiny. There's a family waiting to discover that true love isn't the one that arrives perfect, but the one that decides to grow each day. Comment from which country you follow us and tell us, what moved you most about this story? Do you believe we all deserve a second chance to write our story with Hopes, Inc.?